Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Chairmen of the Boards. We have Dr. Mason right here with us and myself. In this instance, I think today I would be more of a nurse, maybe a sous chef, a mechanic's aide. I don't know what we would be here, but I'm excited for another episode. We're down a chairman today. Brian decided that I think he was getting a little tired of talking to us every week and needed to disappear to Anaheim for a little while. So Brian is in Anaheim on a well-deserved break. And so we're going to get into topic today and talk about some of our favorite tips, tricks, hacks, things to avoid when you're setting up your pedal board. And man, I've got a lot. I don't know if you have some that come to mind right away, Mason, but why don't you take a second and say hey, and we'll get into this thing.
Well, hello all, and welcome. If you're a returning listener or viewer, welcome back. And if you're new, we're glad to have you. Just a reminder, we're number one in Bangladesh and that is not BS. That is true.
Just in case you forgot.
But I do credit the IP rerouting services that are out there. I'm anxious to talk about this because we've done some episodes that are sort of along these lines before, but I feel like as we do more of this and we get more experienced and we see more things, the toolbox becomes deeper. And it's always good to get that information out there and democratize the best practices as we know them and as we learn them. One thing I want to mention before I get into these is we have begun a new page on Facebook, or a group on Facebook that is free and open to the public to join, which is a Chairman of the Boards podcast group. And you can submit questions and talk about stuff like this. And Brian and Grant and I are all on there, and we are conversing with folks. And so we're hoping that this will be a utilized resource of the listeners, where they'll go to Facebook and they'll put questions and talk about their troubleshooting woes and all of those sorts of things. So in any case, could be cool. Please join us there if you'd like to kind of do more beyond the scope of the podcast, or you want to actually ask us direct questions. It's kind of a cool format where we can all engage together. But with that said, in terms of pedal board tricks and tips, well, I think that the standard for me it has always been the measure twice, cut once approach as it relates to everything. Like the more deliberate you can do your planning stages, the easier the rig build will go. And it's just like painting a house or a room. It's like all of the details are in the prep. It's like the unsexy part where you're masking and you're having to put down the drop cloth and all the things that are like not the gratifying part of seeing the wall start, the color of the new wall starting to become whatever it is, in terms of its new hue. It's similar in a rig building process, that the more time you spend on layout, the more time that you spend really methodically measuring everything out. It's not the sexy part because you don't get to see the cool cable runs yet. But believe me that once you get to that part and you've done all this prep work, it is so much more gratifying to not have to rip up the nice work that you have done on account of the fact that you haven't done a good job with your planning. And I think, to me, outside of like the basic skills of like knowing how to solder a cable properly, the big issues with pedal boards that I see when I do consultations with people, which I believe Grant and I both still offer, and maybe even Brian offers this as like a private consulting to people that want, to hire us to kind of have them go through their rig, is that a lot of people use tools that are great tools like Pedalboard Planner and things like that, and they make no account for the depth and width of plugs and connectors or where cables are going to live. And so they're almost imagining as though they have these Bluetooth connections between their pedals that require no 1/4-inch jacks or 2.1 millimeter barrel connectors for the DC. And that's just not the world that we live in. And so we really need to think about all of those contingencies. And I still really like, as like kind of the ultimate first step hack before anything gets bought or built as far as the pedalboard is concerned, is putting all the pedals down on the floor, using some painter's tape, and measuring out the actual dimensions that you need. And I think with jacks in the pedals, like the jacks that you plan to use in the pedals, because those jacks, if you're not using the ones that you're planning to use, those incrementally, individually, not so much. They don't have much of a difference from one brand of right angle or pancake connector to the next. But the accumulation of all those can add up to inches on the pedal board. So this is a very important step that I feel kind of gets whitewashed a little bit. And then it comes back to bite people at the end, where then they have to either make really extreme modifications to the pedal board or have to sacrifice pedals because they just didn't think about how the holistic rig is going to come together. And they're kind of just trying to skip to the end. And I caution people from doing that. That is one of the grave mistakes that I see made over and over again by people that are amateurs that are trying to build a professional grade pedal board. What about you, Graham? What do you see?
I wholeheartedly agree. I think, especially in the day and age that we're in with Instagram and everything gets posted, a photo gets posted, people put all this time into making a super clean cable channel. And if you're into that, as you should, put a bunch of time into that.
And we don't even know if those pedal boards work. They look good.
Exactly.
We don't even know.
Exactly.
We don't even know they work.
They might be Photoshopped. Just take some of Brian's cable channels and just Photoshop them into your boards. Like, hey, I'm done.
They don't even solder them. They just stick them through. You know.
But I think if I could choose between, let's say I got 10 hours to build a board and I'm limited on my resource, I would spend as much time as possible in the planning stage and much rather have a messy, in air quotes, a messy looking board that functions so that I can front load my planning. And I'm hearing you say what you're saying about, the layout, and people might think you're getting a bit nitpicky and, so what if it's a little bit big or the pedals hang over the sides a little bit. And I hear that and I'm like, especially if you're a gigging musician, your pedal board's moving a lot, getting put in a case, out of a case, in the back of your car. The one thing that absolutely kills me that I see in this realm and is a consequence of not planning well is having a DC jack. Let's say you got a Boss tuner at the top right corner of your board, a DC jack just hanging over the edge of the board a bit. And you are asking for someone to knock that, step on it, break it off. Anything that hangs over the edge of the board that is fragile, it should be seen as a huge red flag. And so the worst case in my mind, and this has happened to customers of mine, they plan out their whole build on Pedal Playground. It fits on Pedal Playground digitally. So the digital mock-up, everything looks great. They buy the board based on that mock-up. They buy the pedals based on that mock-up. They set it all up. And sure enough, Pedal Playground is pretty accurate, but it's not perfect. And so you have a larger board and the timeline, the Big Sky, the Mobius, whatever it is across the back row on Pedal Playground fits perfectly. But in reality, they're a few millimeters off on every pedal. And then you have pedals hanging off the edge of your board. And now you need to either, like you alluded to, you either need to take a pedal off or you need to return that pedal board that you just got. And that's not going to be cheap, especially when you take into effect shipping and all that. So planning layout, absolutely. I would add to that as well. I would spend a disproportionate amount of time playing around with your signal chain. So I know like Mason and myself, we've done a lot of content in the past on ideal signal chain, all of which is, in my mind, curious if you agree here, all of which is a starting point. So there is, are we doing cheers? Cheers to you, Mason. Hey,
cheers to you.
Sorry.
Yeah.
So that's all a starting point. And so even overdrive order, where are you going to put modulation? Are you going to put phaser before drive, after, octave before, after? There's so many variations, all of which in my mind is how people get the sound that they fall in love with. It's basically time on the floor where you're just rearranging pedals and like, okay, I'm going to try this into that and that into that. And okay, that's what that sounds like. Now I'm going to unplug it, rearrange it. Now I'm going to try a different order. And eventually over time, you find what you really gel with, what works with your gear, what sounds best to you. And that is the difference in my mind of creating a pedal board that you look forward to using versus a pedal board. It's like, that one thing just really annoys me, but it's too much effort to redo it right now. So I'll just put up with it, and you just keep putting up with it. And it kind of just detracts from the whole enjoyment of the whole process. And so I think that's where planning is massive, and it's the easiest thing to skip past. And this even goes into what pedals you choose. And really, I think another area I see people kind of maybe rushing too much is they'll have 2 or 3 overdrives on their board and they haven't really looked into them that much. And sure enough, they're running 3 TS9s. They're just from different companies and they're different enclosures, but they love all of them. Of course they do, because it's a TS9. But they didn't realize that, I could have a TS9 and maybe a Klon style pedal and maybe a Blues Breaker style pedal, whereas I'm just kind of stacking 3 of the same pedal in a row now. And if you've put in the effort and you realize that, yeah, I know they're 3 TS9s, but I love everything about this, I love the order, then that's great. You should keep it. But if you're just kind of chucking on pedals because you have them and you aren't really thinking it through, I think that's another area that you can often rush. So planning 100%, I think is the first thing to kind of go out the window. And I would tag on to this lastly, and then I'll throw back to you. I've made this mistake personally where I didn't write down everything that gets Velcroed to the board, everything that gets attached to the board. I didn't write it down, and I get through my whole layout. It's like, it's fitting better than I realized. And sure enough, I forgot my tuner. And so I did a whole bunch of work. Velcro, like I dual locked everything down. And then my tuner was just sitting off on the other side of the room in the corner. And I just had to redo a whole bunch of stuff because I didn't have my list in front of me, ticking it off as I went, making sure that I was, not forgetting anything crucial. So I think writing down fixtures is how I refer to them. Anything that needs to be attached, writing down power taps, what's going to be powered off of which tap on your board, making sure you have enough power taps, all that type of stuff. I think you kind of have to be meticulous right from the get-go. All that to say, I agree. What do you think? Any other additions or any next tips and tricks you'd kind of add to this?
One thing I think is just part of this layout component is I like to, when I'm putting a pedal on the board, let's just say that I have this receive side of a long line. This ordinarily wouldn't go on a pedal board, but just for the purposes of something that I have handy that's on hand, is I would ordinarily kind of even pencil out all of the items on the board so that I kind of have a map, so to speak, of kind of where things are going to go. This is especially once I've kind of already done a rough layout where nothing's attached. This does 2 things for me. It allows me to more easily identify where sort of the Velcro or dual lock needs to be in terms of spatially on the pedal board. There are many different techniques for dual lock application. Typically what I do is if I've traced everything out in its place, I'll put down the squares of dual lock or a strip of dual lock, depending on the surface area of the pedal that I'm dealing with. I'll put that on a clean surface on the pedal board first, and then I'll mirror that with the corresponding sides. I'll peel, and I won't press it down fully. I'll kind of just get it enough loops attached where it's holding in place, but it's not fully attached. And then I will use that outline with the pencil to lay the pedal down so that it's mirroring what's on the kind of pedal board surface. And then that becomes sort of mirrored to the bottom of the pedal. And then I can sort of, more deliberately kind of push that adhesive down into the back of the pedal and then fully attach it. I like using that pencil thing because, again, it gives me a map, but it also kind of shows me where my cable channeling is going to naturally fall. And as the pedal board starts to get more pedals on it and attached, sometimes you can lose sight of where the natural channels might be, but you can see it a little bit more clearly when you've kind of penciled it out and there actually isn't anything occupying that space. So I especially when you're dealing with switchers or things where there's a lot of cables that are going to be going back and forth, a true bypass looper would be the same thing. This really helps you identify where are the natural places where a larger loom of cables might be able to fit in and then break out to the various sends and returns, or where is it going to break out into one half of the switcher is going to be, the cables are going to be coming in from this side, and then the other half of the switcher, they're going to be coming in from this side because we have this natural gap between pedal 1 and 2 and a natural gap between pedals 6 and 7 or whatever it is. I just think it helps you ID where the obvious spacing is. The other thing that it does for me as well is if let's say I have a first row that's penciled out, I can go through and either pencil my straight edge or tape out my straight edge so that I know where my cable management tie-down mounts are going to go, because I've determined what the deepest pedal is on my first row, and I know that I'm going to start building my zip tie and tie down mount line, and I'm going to mark that based on the deepest pedal, because typically, we'll have the cable management be in a somewhat linear fashion. It won't kind of, look like a game of Tetris, in terms of its position where it moves up and down throughout the pedal board. So this just kind of helps determine those lines as well, where the cable routing is going to go and where you're going to do some of the placement of the zip ties and tie down mounts.
And I think as well, something that another mistake in this kind of realm is, especially on switcher boards, is people that pack their layout and they've made sure it all fits and all that, but they don't plan out where the big cable channels are going to go. And you need to leave room for that, mainly for a switcher. For non-switcher boards or series boards, it's less of a concern. But you need sometimes to leave, a full inch, maybe an inch and a half, depending how crazy you're going, of space for a single cable loom. And you got to plan for it. And I've been caught on that as well. And it's not fun when you're mid-build. You can't change the board size. You can't change the layout. And then you just spend all this extra time like, oh, now I got to split up all these looms. I got to make sacrifices all over the place just because I didn't plan well enough. And so, I think that's great. So to make sure I understand what you're saying, because I think this is a cool idea, you draw pencil lines directly on the pedal board surface.
Yeah. I just do it with like a really, like a really fine tip mechanical pencil, and so they it cleans off super easily. Like even just a damp rag will get rid of the pencil. But I like it because it gives me a really easy place to sort of like see where everything is going to be, and it helps me sort of identify kind of focus areas again for routing purposes, but then it also again allows me to pull my straight edge pretty easily without any pedals being on there, because once pedals start going down, it's not like it's impossible to be able to pull a straight line for your cable routing and stuff like that. It's just easier to do work on the pedal board when there aren't any pedals on there, because you're not having to reach over stuff, and it's just less cramped. It's easier to work. I've even done, I'm not building pedal boards at the rate that you and Brian do, but when I was, sometimes even, especially for switcher boards, when I knew where everything was, I would try to do as much of the work without the pedals on there. Like I would get all the Velcro and everything down, but I would try to do as much of the routing as I could without anything there. And I've even seen Brian do this to a degree where you'll see that he'll build out the channels of with all the cables actually attached, and then just have like unterminated cables that are marked for every pedal that just break off from the main loom or of cable as needed, or based on where the pedals are going to be. And that's really handy because it's always cramped trying to solder in these small spaces with pedals present and stuff like that. So it kind of takes some of that out of the equation. Now you're not always going to be able to do that, but when you can, it's a huge convenience because you don't have to contend with anything else that's taking up space on the board as you're starting to assemble cables and all that stuff. And normally when I'm soldering on a board that already has cables placed, I'm using various towels or like old shirts, and that have holes or stains to kind of prevent any sort of solder splashes or any damage to the pedals as I'm working over the pedal board. And this just kind of removes that whole component.
Yeah. I like that.
Yeah.
There was one other thing I was going to say along those lines, but I may have lost it. I do think as well.
It might come back to you.
Oh, this is it. So one of the things that drives me nuts on this, and I've seen my guys, the guys on my team here do this in the past, and I had to bring it up right away, was when you're doing an angled board or something where you can mount pedals underneath, there's, gaps or holes in the pedal board. And putting down a pedal with dual lock on it and the adhesive side of that dual lock kind of overlaps a gap. So when you look underneath the pedal board, you see some bare adhesive, and within a day, it is covered in dirt and hair. Like, it just looks terrible. And so I think planning out as well, wear your dual lock, for the love of God. Don't put it over a gap in a pedal board. If you want to drive me crazy, just send me a photo of one of those things and it'll ruin my day. But I think planning that out for, aesthetically, yeah. But as well, you want the adhesive needs to stick to something. And so you might think that your pedal board or pedals, are stuck down properly. But if 90% of that is just hanging over air, obviously it's not going to be doing much for you. Yeah. So that's one of my pet peeves. One of the things I do love about dual lock specifically, though, is, and this can be used all sorts of places, is the ability to use dual lock as a riser. If you ever need to just bump a pedal up just a little bit more, you can put 2 layers of dual lock, or if you're using 2314, which is a 4 millimeter thick patch cable by Mogami, you can use 1 layer of dual lock and still fit 2314 underneath a pedal because the dual lock is high enough to clear it. And so that can get you out of a bind. It's a way to kind of hide the cables cleanly. And it just comes in handy a lot of the time if you need to, run a cable to a spot that doesn't have a whole lot of room. Dual lock allows you to clear that. And so I think dual lock is, there's the whole debate of dual lock versus Velcro. In my mind, dual lock
I don't think there's a debate. I was trying to find this photo on my phone here because there are examples of people, this is also along the lines of dual lock, is that they actually, I think, they go too close to the edge. And we've talked about this, I think, before from an aesthetic standpoint. Yeah. So people who are used to ordinary Velcro, you can, if this is the bottom of your pedal, and I'm going to try to explain this to people that are listening only, with regular Velcro, you can kind of go almost to the edge on something and really not see it because there is no height to it. But on dual lock, if you go all the way to the edge and you put it on a pedal board, you will always see the edge. It'll always look like there's something under it.
Just a little off.
And so I'm always explaining to people in the DIY context, you do not need to go all the way to the edge. In fact, I recommend that you inset the dual lock at least a quarter of an inch from the edge. You can translate that to metrics. And I would also say avoid covering any screws. Like there shouldn't be any need for you to cover the screws to remove the bottom. There just isn't, especially if you're using dual lock, because it's so much more what's the word? It's so much more difficult to remove than regular Velcro as far as like separating like the pedal from the pedal board. There's not going to be any advantage for you to try to cover that space. So like, even if that means that you're insetting a 1/2 inch in from the edge, it doesn't matter. It's not going to affect its ability to stay on the pedal board. So don't cover the screws. Don't go all the way to the edge. Give yourself a little bit of clearance and it'll look so much better on the pedal board. I promise you that. And then to Grant's point about the traditional industrial hook and loop Velcro versus dual lock, there really is no contest as far as if you want something to stay in place, there's no chance that it's going to come off if you are if that is the main objective. Now, there are people that have really modular pedal boards and they want to be able to remove the pedals by hand. And so in that case, they'll use traditional Velcro. I could understand it for that context, but I for pretty much anybody who's practically traveling and they're using this on a board that flies, there is an issue with regular Velcro where it just can't take a lot of impact without pedals lifting off from the Velcro because it's just not as strong. And so, there'll be a case where people will find sort of pedals sort of floating or having released themselves from the Velcro, and then they get seated back in a different position because they're just not stuck to the pedal board in a way that the Velcro can be able to support. I've really never had any issues with dual lock if the surface is clean to begin with. There are some issues that will happen if people have not properly cleaned the pedalboard surface in advance of applying the dual lock. Then things like moisture and humidity can become a factor. And that's not to say that dual lock has never failed. I know that for some people it has. I will say this. I believe the clear dual lock is better than the black dual lock. And the black dual lock has a white adhesive on the bottom that's kind of like a spongier material. And I think it's pretty good. But I think that the clear one is superior in its ability to stay on a surface. Because I've seen the black one is the only one that I've seen where like actually the physical adhesive will separate itself from like the plastic hook or the plastic little mushrooms, if that makes sense. And so you're kind of just left with this residue of the white foamy adhesive. I've never seen the clear one do it. It's almost like the clear one kind of has like the texture of almost like silicone or something like that, where it's different.
More rubber.
I don't know if you've had this experience, Grant.
Well,
but
there's a bunch of part numbers that 3M offers, and oddly enough, I didn't know this was your opinion, but I did a bunch of tests, and I love the look of the black dual lock. So I use the black dual lock, but the part number ends in CF, and it's the clear adhesive on the back. So I use the rubberized adhesive with the black dual lock. And because the all black aesthetic for me, I love it. So
I agree. I was unattached. I couldn't. And the truth of the matter is that 99% of the time both work fine.
Yeah.
Just the only times I've ever had issues is been with the black one, but it's not been like a consistent thing. It was like one pedal board out of 100 had this issue, I think though that it's pretty untouchable. I mean, if you're not building a rig with dual lock now, unless you're just like a complete basket case and can't commit to anything, then there's no reason that we should be using ordinary Velcro. I think it's worth the investment. And even if it is somewhat modular, use like SJ3550. It's, a little less dense, and you can definitely remove it by hand if you want to, but it's not going to go anywhere if you don't want it to.
And another big mistake I see people saying, and then we can move on from dual lock, but the especially with a switcher, a bigger pedal, a timeline, a MIDI switcher, something with a lot of surface area, is they put, and I've done the same thing, way too much on, and it is impossible to remove, almost to the point of bending the chassis.
It's hard to even get it on sometimes if there's too much.
Like you can't.
You have to like.
And so you don't, even for a switcher, let's say an RJM PBC10 or a timeline, let's say a Strymon timeline, something that everyone will be familiar with. For that, I would probably use 4 pieces that are 1.5 inches each. So in each corner of the timeline, I'd put 1.5 inch strip. I would not be putting 2 full-length strips across the whole bottom of the timeline. It's way too much, and you're just not going to be able to get it off. And so I would say that. The one thing as well with dual lock is it releases with impact. So I haven't had this issue in the last 5 years since switching part numbers, but when we started using dual lock, and man, I think we used a lot of it around 2015 area, and we would have guys that went through TSA, and TSA dropped their pedal board from some height upside down, and there wasn't compression on top of all the pedals from the case. So the case wasn't touching all the pedals, and Dual Lock would release some of those pedals. And so I guess in that instance, maybe we didn't use enough, but since switching part numbers, that has never been an issue. And I don't even remember the last time I've used Velcro on a build or had it requested. But the other thing with Dual Lock, especially on these mini pedals, a 1590B, a finger enclosure, like the really mini pedals, Velcro, it just rocks back and forth. Like it doesn't have the kind of solid feel that Dual Lock has. And so even on a feel or use case type scenario, when you're actually using the board, Dual Lock is far superior in that regard. So
the worst offender to me on that one is like the exotic enclosures, which are a little bit different than standard. They're like higher, like a EP booster or something like that.
Higher center
They're
of gravity.
slightly taller than the ordinary enclosure that's like that. And they must be getting those made for them or something because they're not the standard size. But the challenge with those is that because they have such a high center of gravity because of their enclosure shape, those tend to be a little trickier. And sometimes when I Dual Lock those, I will have to go all the way to the edge, even though I know that it doesn't look as good because I'm trying to get as much rigidity to it as possible. Because if you hit it from one side of the foot switch where it's like at its tallest point, you can get enough leverage to pull it off, even if you're using a more dense Dual Lock. The other thing, last thing about Dual Lock application, I don't know if this has been something that you found, Grant, but typically I think it's better from a adhesion and like staying on the board to do squares in corners or have 4 points of contact as opposed to 2. Because sometimes, depending on the size of the pedal, you can get a lot more movement if there's like 2 points of contact that are longer than if there are 4. And so I prefer when I can to use 4 squares, 1 in each corner, as opposed to using 2 longer strips. Again, obviously the size of the enclosure dictates this. If you're using an EP booster, you can't do that. You know, like the strips would be too small, or the 4 corners would be too small to do anything consequential to keep it on there. But if you have something that's like this size, like the receive box, this would be fine to do that. You know, it can be a little trickier, like on a Phase 90 size. You can still do it, and again, the challenge is it almost ends up being the same width as a strip because of how you put them on there. But those gaps in between where there are separate contact points still make it a lot more grippy as far as how it sticks to the pedal board.
Nice. I like that.
So just some food for thought. I'll even do that with switchers, like on a PVC 6. I'll put, 100%. 6 points of contact, as opposed to having strips of it. I just think it feels more secure when you're doing it like that.
Yeah. I like that.
I want to break for a second if we could, Grant. And that may have been right where you were leading me.
I was leading. Yeah. No, that's great. Take it.
I want to talk to you about a company that is a fine purveyor of musical instruments, amplifiers, and pedals. It is our friends over at the Guitar Sanctuary in McKinney, Texas. Now, you could, of course, go to the Guitar Sanctuary, which is a suburb of the Dallas-Fort Worth area, there in McKinney, Texas, and buy this stuff yourself or check some stuff out if you want. But you can also head to their website, guitarsanctuary.com, and you can peruse all the amazing devices that they might have. This could include things from Goodwood. This could include things from Vertex. This could include some of the cool things that you saw featured at the NAMM show, either in person or online. And you could call them up. You could talk to Brian Meter or the other staff there, and you could say, hey, I want to know a little bit more about pedal XYZ, or I wanted you to tell me about this amplifier or guitar. And chances are they may even have that in stock, and they're definitely going to be experts being able to tell you exactly about all the things you need to know in order to make sure you're buying the right piece of gear for you. So check them out, guitarsanctuary.com over in McKinney, Texas. Go in person, search it on the web. Also, I want to talk to you about Neural DSP. In my opinion, they are the leaders. They are the high watermark as it relates to amplifier-based plugins. And the Quad Cortex, to me, as far as amp simulators are concerned, as far as devices that do amplifier captures are concerned, it is, again, still the high watermark of the industry. They make some amazing stuff. And not only are their plugins 30% off to our listeners using the coupon code Chairmen, CHAIRMEN, just in case you wanted to know, many of the plugins are now available to be migrated onto a Quad Cortex. So if you have a Quad Cortex and you already own some of these plugins, you can migrate many of them to your Quad and use them as though they were already native on the Quad, which is amazing. And they are slowly but surely making more of these plugins available to be able to be used in both places. And if you've already purchased the plugin, of course, you have access to put it on your Quad Cortex if you have one of those as well. So you can take all your favorite plugins and make them mobile. I love it. They have the best capture software out there. You can put all your amps up on the cloud. You can share them with friends or keep them to yourself. And again, 30% off any of the plugins that you desire, as long as they are 90 days or older. Head over to neuraldsp.com and make sure that you use the coupon code Chairmen, CHAIRMEN, at checkout. Get 30% off. That's 70% away from free. Let's now talk more about pedalboard tips, tricks, and hacks and best practices. Grant, where do you want to go next in this conversation?
Well, I have a question for you. I want to gauge your temperature here. This has come up a lot recently in console calls for customers and setups and all that.
Okay. I'm ready.
I have increasingly been convicted, could be a good way to put it, to tell customers and forewarn them in the planning stages, like we were talking about earlier, to not have eyes that are bigger than their stomachs. Basically, the thing I always say in these calls, especially on bigger boards, is if you don't need to have it, get rid of it. If you don't need that feature, don't put it on. Stop thinking of the, well, maybe one day type scenarios as much as possible, and just think more in the realm of, I know I'm going to use this pedal. I know where that preset is used and which song it's for. Basically, the whole idea, seeing these gigantic pedal boards, which I'm not against, by the way. If you can justify every decision on that board, that is the right size board for you. But I think in earlier days of Goodwood, where people would ask for the moon of like, okay, yep, I think we can make that happen. Now, more and more, I question why do you have 2 timelines on your board? Why do you have 5 overdrives? And if they can tell me in a coherent way why, like, great, you've thought it through. Most of the time, though, it's a just in case, or sometime in the future I may, or whatever it might be. I'm curious where you stand on this. I think I may know, but I want to pose the question.
There are so many people that go to the tone buffet, and
nice.
Yes, and they see that there's the sushi area. They see that there's the prime rib area. They see that there is, the dessert area, and they're just piling everything on their tray because they want to be able to enjoy it all. And the reality is those people, I will say, when I was doing this as a gig, those were the people that came back to me a certain number of months later and wanted to rebuild with a more judicious setup, because they realized that they had too many palettes to work from. And it really doesn't work unless that's been your workflow previously. The most successful pedalboard builds, and I don't mean that in terms of the execution of me or anybody building it as the measure of success. The measure of success is if the pedalboard is used in the way that it was built for, I think, at least a few years, or let's just even say a year. Like that is the person getting value from their investment. If they have had this pedalboard built, and it's immediately changing in becoming something different, or having to swap pedals and all this stuff. This means that there was not a successful rig build, in my opinion, because the person didn't do their homework up front to really vet pedals. And I'm always suspicious when people are buying pedals and sending them to me, when I was doing this again for hire, that they had never played before. They were just buying it strictly off of something that they had heard or had been recommended. Like, that is just such a wild card to throw onto the rig, something that you're unfamiliar with. And so I always enjoyed most building rigs for people that had been using a core group of pedals for a really long time and really knew those pedals well and how they were supposed to react. And it makes it easier for me in turn as well, because if there's something that when they hear the pedalboard, they're like, this pedal is not reacting the way that I expected, because I'm so familiar with this. What could that be? And it gives me feedback about, like, okay, well, maybe this pedal is, like, I've mentioned this story before. I built a rig before Exact Tone was based in Nashville. There was nobody doing rigs. And so guys like Tom Bukovac used to have me build them rigs, and they would send all their stuff out to California. And I think I built Tom maybe 3 pedal boards over the course of like 10 years, something like that. And I remember when I first started, doing mods to his Noble's ODR1, like Exact Tone does a much nicer job than I did, but I was kind of the first one that I was aware of that was taking them and rehousing them into Hammond boxes. And they kind of took that to a whole nother level and do a beautiful job. Mine were still totally functional, but it was, theirs were very pretty. But one thing that he noticed on this rig with this rehoused Nobles, he's like, man, this pedal doesn't sound right anymore. Like, it sounds like there's just something that's slightly different about it. And I was like, man, what could that be? And I realized that in creating a new bypass foot switch for the original FET bypass foot switch, that I bypassed that FET because it's like, well, we don't need that anymore for the purposes of turning this thing on and off.
Basically a buffer.
But that has a color to it. And it wasn't that he didn't want it true bypass. It's just that when it was on, it still needed to have that FET in series. And even though it was using that FET as a function to change the state of the bypass, it was still in circuit all the time. And so having to add that component back in was a significant change that he could hear the difference of. And so, but if you're dealing with somebody who is already dealing with unfamiliar devices, they probably wouldn't make that distinction because they wouldn't know the difference between how it should sound because they've been using it this way and how it sounds when they're using it in the moment. And so those people were always really fun for me to build for because it was a good calibration of my abilities to be able to represent what they knew in the best possible fashion. And they could tell me immediately if it wasn't meeting the mark. And then I could go back and figure out how to do it if it needed that, or they'd said, "Hey, it's working great. It sounds as good or better than it ever has." And like that's always what you want to hear, and not just here, but how you want to execute the build in that it results in that fashion. So, I'm to answer the question. I think it is a nightmare proposal that is ultimately going to lead to you doing this rig again in a smaller fashion. If somebody is just, overdid it at the Tone Buffet, you just can't, it's just
I feel like
too
all
hard.
buffets are, from my personal experience, filled with regret and self-loathing. Whenever I finish a buffet, I'm like, well, I knew this was going to happen. Why did I show up here today? And it's the same for pedalboards, big pedalboards that I built in the past for myself.
Do they have Sizzler in Canada?
If they don't currently, they did in the past. Okay. I don't know if Sizzler is still around or not, probably for good reason.
You were a Sizzler guy back in the day, Grant?
No, I never went. I'm thinking more like hotel buffets. I would probably be eating 8 eggs and 12 pieces of bacon and 4 cups of coffee. I overdo it. And so now I just got to know tonally and for food reasons as well. You got to stay away from the buffets. And
the only one I really love is Fogo de Chao, the Brazilian
never
steakhouse. Oh boy!
Oh
yeah.
yes.
Yeah,
we called those churrascos in Australia. I've never been to one in North America, but churrasco, again, filled with regret. But that one was worth it. I'll say the Brazilian barbecue is worth it.
Yeah, it's pretty good. It's pretty good, I have to say. It's fancy, on the fancier side as far as buffets go. But boy,
did they do the pineapple? Did they come around with a barbecued pineapple? That was the highlight for me. Oh man,
they do that. My favorite one my favorite cut is called picanha, and it's kind of, the meat is sort of bent in like the shape of a kidney, and then like the fat cap is on the back. So that kind of gets like crispy, but then they cut it, thinly sliced. It's amazing. It's amazing. Shout out to all of our Brilliant listeners. They know exactly what I'm talking about right now.
I think the last thing on this one is, I think the thing that disappoints me the most, not from the customer point of view, but like, I should have caught this, is when I hear from customers a year and a half later, 2 years later, and this is a common one if the board has been overdone, is less about the amount of pedals and more about, I hear like, it's just too hard to transport. I don't use it because it's too big, too heavy. I hate transporting this thing around. And that just kind of kills me. Like, you've invested all this money, all this time, and you can't even use it the way that you'd hoped. And versus the other side, I heard from a customer the other day. I did their rig 4 or 5 years ago, and I still use it every week. I love it. I haven't changed a thing. It's serving all of my needs that I need from this pedal board. And like, that's what I want to hear. And if that means a board that's half the size that you planned, then by all means, you should do a board half the size than what you're planning, because you want to look forward to using it. And I think the argument of, I need flexibility, so I need more pedals and all that, put an audition point in. Like, make sure that you can patch in a pedal on the side of your board easily if you're into that, or pick 1 or 2 common spots on the board, leave a bit of extra room around those pedals so that you make it easy and you plan to swap pedals out regularly in those spots, and just have a smaller board. I think every time I've had a smaller board and I run into a situation where I just need this sound and I can't get it, it has made me a better guitar player, because I have to come up with another solution. I have to look at my board and think, what do I have? How can I create that sound with what I have available to me, rather than, I've got 5 different ways I could get that sound. I can do that. It never pans out the way I hope. I've never regretted having too few pedals on my board. I have almost always regretted having too many pedals on my board. And I think it's probably one of the top things that you could do, is just have a board that is a little bit smaller, has a few less features than you think you need. And I think it's much better overall than the inverse or the converse of that, than having a little bit too much or making it a little bit too hard to transport. So I think that's a big one. I don't think many people are going to hear us when we say that, but I do think it's a very important one to temper your appetite for what you want to fit on your pedal board.
I think one thing that fits into that really well, that especially for people that are not playing their own music, like, that's always the easiest person to build for. Like, the person that has their gig, they know what it is, and they are hired or getting the gigs because of whatever it is that they do. They usually are more honed in on the effects that really work for them, because they don't have to try to be a chameleon based on the gig. Yep. And those can sometimes be trickier boards. But again, speaking of boards that were successful, in other words, executed well, and the person ended up using them for many years, a lot of them, for the people that needed to be chameleons, they definitely needed to utilize some sort of multi-effect. Like, whether that was something like an M5. The HX1 wasn't really around when I was doing this. The M5 was kind of the closest to that would have existed. But H9 existed as well. So basically a pedal that could kind of be anything in a strategic place on the pedal board that would kind of make it work signal path-wise for whatever it was. this typically for most of my customers would fall into kind of the novelty modulation realm, and maybe sometimes even like octave or filtering, but was something that was definitely like an effect of the day that was to be used that day and would never really be used again. And they could dial in that sound. They had it in a good place on the pedal board to be able to achieve that. And then they would use the software that was built into the product, or, you know, if it was an H9, they'd use their phone or app to be able to make the adjustment. And that just gives you so much mileage, because it's basically taking the place of having to have, you know, a bunch of individual pedals that aren't really part of the core element. And I think that that's a brilliant thing for people that have sort of like staple overdrives and boosts and delays and reverbs, but kind of the other stuff is variable, like using a multi-effects or even two multi-effects in those strategic places just give you so much flexibility. And one rig that I did that was really cool had one of these, I'm trying to remember who made it, but basically it was like it had two effects loops for two pedals, like so groups of send and returns, and then it had like an insert point in between them, and you could essentially swap the order of the two effects loops to either be, you know, to basically swap positions, so the pedals that were wired between them could either have the effect going pre or post that group of effects. They couldn't both be on the same side. But I think it might have been T1M. You remember that company?
This one's mine. Yep.
Yeah, I think it was him. It might have been another company. But it was cool in that they had an H9 and they had an M5, because they like certain effects in one that wasn't in the other. And this was kind of in the early days of like pedalboard based switchers. Probably now this would just be done in a switcher. But at the time it was cool because like this guy really liked the tremolo sounds and some of the octave sounds in the M5, but preferred sort of like the chorus and the detune of the
Sounds
H9.
right.
And so he could move them based on the effect that he wanted and where he thought that effect was most appropriate in the signal path.
Yep.
Now we don't have to worry about that because most of the switchers have ordering or reordering capabilities, so you could just have it wired anywhere and just move it based on the preset. But at that time, I think the only switchers that were around were like Musicom Lab, and maybe Voodoo Lab had something that was semi-programmable, and I'm trying to think of who else would have had stuff back then. There weren't many. And none of them were reorderable. So this made it, you know, you had to use devices like this in order to swap orders. But anyway, it was really cool. And I thought, man, this is kind of like making the most out of multi-effects that were available at the time.
Yeah, I like that.
Yeah.
I know we need to finish up here soon, but I want to tell you guys about two more sponsors that make the podcast possible. The first one is Bestronix. And Brad at Bestronix is, I like to think of him as the best possible version of an enabler. He helps me finish rigs well, and whether I need D-sockets, plugs, cable, he enables me to finish the rig. That could have come across very negative, but I mean it in the best way possible. And so coming to Brad with solutions that I don't quite know, does this part exist? Or do you have anything like this? And 9 times out of 10, he is able to find that part for me, point me in the right direction, and really make me look like the hero to my customers. And so Brad, whether you need to contact him directly, you need bulk parts, cables, connectors, DC jacks, you need some help with your rig and finishing it off, looms, rack accessories, Bestronix is definitely the place to go. So check them out at btpa.com. Ask for Brad, tell him the chairman sent you. And if you want to save some money, use the code DACHAIRS, DACHAIRS, for 10% off your order. I also want to tell you about a Canadian friend of mine, Greg. He owns a music store in Red Deer, Alberta. And so for all of our Canadian listeners, he carries the best brands. He carries Vertex, he carries Goodwood, and a whole lot of other studio and guitar related gear. The music store, if I haven't said it already, is called GB Music and Sound. And man, is it impressive. The fit out is beautiful. If you find yourself in Red Deer, please do yourself a favor and check it out. All of the info, how to, make use of the link, everything is below in the show notes. And by supporting Greg at GB and all of our other sponsors, for the whole episode today, you are supporting this show and helping us to keep things moving. So please use that link if you're interested and check them out. And I do not think you'll be disappointed. So for all of our Canadians, GB Music and Sound. For all of our American listeners, theguitarsanctuary.com. And I think you guys are going to be very happy with both of those stores. So please check them out. So Mason, as we finish up here, any kind of final big category advice that you would give people in the setup realm? Maybe they're halfway through a build and there's one piece of advice you'd kind of leave them with. Is there anything that kind of springs to mind that we haven't already covered?
Yeah. I think that some of these are things that if you've listened to me or any of the podcasts for any amount of time, you've probably heard us just say ad nauseum, but solder your cables. There really is no substitute for a quality soldered cable relative to anything else. If you look at the bulk of the rig building community, everybody's soldering their cables. And if there are people that aren't, I believe they will admit that it is inferior. And I think that if reliability is what you care about, that is something that you will absolutely need to do. Like, just don't take a chance in not stacking the deck in your favor. It is an incredible skill to learn. Once you know how to do it, you will never have to pay for an instrument cable again. It is well worth the investment. I have tons of videos showing how to make soldered cables. I think, Grant, you might even have some as well.
Yeah, I don't know. About to launch a product if it's not out already on this exact thing as well.
Yeah. So there's just so many resources out there to show you how to do it. On our videos, we list all the materials, what cables we use, where we get the plugs. Bestronix, one of our sponsors, has all these available, and they're priced very competitively and have bulk discounts if you're going to be buying, quantities greater than, 10 plus plugs. And it's just such a savings, you can buy plugs, for a few bucks each. Cable is, cents on the dollar, for every foot. And man, it's such a good skill to learn. So soldered cable is an absolute necessity as far as rig building is concerned. And I think the other thing that's just a trick, or maybe not a trick, but just again, something we've talked about is using switch mode power supplies. And these are kind of mostly what we're seeing now from most brands, whether it's Mono, whether it's Walrus, whether it's Chalks, Strymon, all the new Voodoo Lab stuff is now this way. But in essence, without getting too much into the technology differences, they're not relying on a toroidal transformer to create the power, and these work at any voltage that you might need, and that's voltage coming from the wall. So you could be in Singapore, you could be in Europe, you could be in America, and the same power supply is going to work in all those locations. And the benefit of the switch mode is it's much lighter. It can work at all these different voltages, and it doesn't have this issue with the transformer where if you're running pedals too close to it or you're running pedals on top of it, as you might be on something like a pedal train where the power supply mounts underneath, you're not going to have any noise issues that are a consequence of the transformer inside that power supply. The switch mode stuff in the applications that we're using it when designed for audio is quieter than the alternative linear power supply. And I know that there are some people, when we've talked about linear versus switch mode, they say, well, the switch mode's so much noisier and the linear, is quieter. And I think they're comparing to switch mode in general and not switch mode that is specific to our field. the switch mode stuff has been used for a really long time in pro audio. It's kind of now just started to make its way into pedals, and the technology just keeps getting better and better and less expensive. And I think we're seeing that from everybody from, again, True Tone, Chalks, Strymon, Voodoo Lab. They've all moved over to this. And I think it's really great. I think it makes your pedalboard lighter. I think it gives you the ability to run much higher current pedals. I think it also gives you the ability to run multiple different voltages. This is part of the reason why I'm such a fan of Chalks, is not only does it have a ton of current available on every output, but it also has the ability to run between 9, 12, 15, and 18 volts on every single output. And any rig builder will tell you, not having to route cables for your power based on where the higher voltage outputs are on your power supply is just such a relief, because ordinarily you would have to route things and make sure that it was going to feed into a very specific output that had a variable voltage selection on it. With Chalks, you don't have to care about any of that. As long as it fits into the power supply, it's any port in the storm will work, and so it's really handy to do that. So switch mode power supplies, if you're wondering what those are, I have some videos on it. Grant may even have some videos on it that give you sort of an outline of what it means and which ones might be considerations for you. They're just a huge lifesaver when it comes to building rigs, and just kind of removes this whole concern about noise generated from the power supply and what pedals can get close to it. That whole concern is eliminated.
Love it. Last thing I'll say is one mistake I've made almost all of these myself, but I see other people doing as well, is they get a brand new pedal board, they've wired it up themselves or they've had someone else wire it up for them, and they go straight to a gig with it. And they basically put an untested, not in the sense that they've tested that audio passes, but just using the rig. They're unfamiliar with it maybe, or not as familiar as they should be. They go straight into a gigging environment and they don't realize how to use it, or something goes down and they don't know how to fix it quickly. And so the rig is not as familiar as it should be before they use it in a context where there's something to lose. So I would always say, never take an untested or unfamiliar board into a gigging environment. Use it in a rehearsal or two, program it, make sure you like how it's programmed, how it's used, all that, and then bring it into an environment that you actually need to rely on it after you've put a couple hours, even a couple weeks into it beforehand. So, excuse me, don't rush that process as well. Only use it once you know it. And I think you will be very grateful that you took the time there as well. Other than that, Mason, I know we could keep talking about this for weeks. All the mistakes that we've made over the years and the lessons we've learned, and pass that on. But I think we'll finish it up there for today. Thank you guys for listening. Please as well, take the time on Apple Podcasts, if you can, to review the podcast. It does wonders for us, leaving an honest review, getting it to people that will also enjoy this and be able to learn from the stuff that we're all talking about. And check out the Facebook page as well. As a reminder, ask questions, and that will also help us inform what we should be chatting about next on the show. If you have episode ideas, put them in the Facebook group. And we would love to get ideas of what you guys really want to hear and what episodes you'd love to chat about. So thank you in advance for leaving a review, checking out the Facebook page. And Mason, I'll let you sign off.
All right. Well, thank you again, Grant, for hosting us today. And yes, please do check out the Facebook group. I think it's a really great way to stay engaged and ask questions or clarifications for stuff that we talk about in the video or in these podcasts, or just other things that you have questions about as you're putting your rig together. Our intent is to make it a resource for people to be able to go to with these sorts of technical questions where they might not otherwise have somebody to be able to ask it of. And so why not 3 people that have been doing this or have done this in the past and have lots of experience? We're happy to help. So until next week, we'll see you guys for the next episode.